In 1817, Thomas Jefferson, former president and author of the Declaration of Independence, made a simple request. He asked for a book from Philadelphia. Not a rare manuscript or scientific treatise, but a practical pricing guide, used by cabinet makers and chair makers. To his surprise, he was refused. The craftsman told the former president their book of prices was for members only. It contained detailed, standardized formulas for pricing every stage of fine cabinet and chair work, the very same formulas behind the elegant furniture furnishing Independence Hall and Carpenter's Hall. Jefferson, a profound understanding of craftsmanship, was denied access to this ordinary document. I spent weeks digging into the story, trying to understand why such a refusal would happen. My own journey into this hidden history began with a single piece of furniture, my grandmother's solid oak chair. Made in the 1840s, nearly 2 centuries later, it still sits perfectly level. No wobble, no creak. The joinery remains tight. The finish carries a quiet warmth. I expected to find a name, a workshop. Instead, I discovered an entire economic system, very different from what we assume has always been the norm. Craftsmen who built furniture like this were not paid by the hour. They did not take out loans. They were part of the guild system, a network of skilled trades shaping work and community life since colonial times. Once I understood how that system functioned, I saw why it eventually had to be dismantled and forgotten. Philadelphia cabinet makers and chair makers were master craftsmen, combining roles of designers, joiners, and finishers. For public buildings or private homes, these guilds delivered work of lasting quality. Their book of prices, which Jefferson could not obtain, was built around unit pricing. Every dovetail joint, every turned leg, every carved detail, every sheet of veneer had a standardized, fair price. These prices were not determined by market demand or a wealthy client's persuasion. Instead, they were set by experienced measurers in teams of at least 2, ensuring checks and balances. The entire system was designed with fairness in mind, for the craftsman and the client. Payment was remarkably flexible. Work exchanged for food, services, raw materials, or extended credit. A 1928 report described a barter system throughout the first century of settlement. Scarce currency was little used. Face-to-face arrangements bound communities through mutual obligation and trust. The obvious criticism: this was primitive and inefficient. Local currencies varied widely. Barter could be cumbersome. Guilds sometimes acted like monopolies. Official histories emphasize the chaos by the 1850s and early 1860s. More than 7,000 different state banknotes in circulation. A $5 bill from New York worth less in New Jersey. Counterfeit currency was so common it was hard to know what was real. The chaos was real. But here is what I keep returning to. Furniture crafted under the old guild system still stands strong. Buildings constructed by master builders from these networks still serve their original purpose centuries later. Communities held together by personal relationships produced objects of remarkable durability. At what point did we decide the only choices were chaos or tight central control? When did we stop asking if something different, more human scale, might still work? The turning point came clearly in the early 1860s. On February 25, 1863, Lincoln signed the National Currency Act. It passed the Senate by a razor-thin margin of 23 to 21, just 2 votes. The act created the office of the Comptroller of the Currency, laying the foundation for the first national banking system. We are taught this was a necessary reform for stability and a uniform national currency. But the legislation stated its purpose more plainly: to help finance the Civil War. National banks were required to purchase Treasury securities equal to at least 1/3 of their capital. In return, they received banknotes they could issue, worth about 90% of the bond's value. The more bonds they bought, the more money they could put into circulation. a system engineered to turn banks into reliable buyers of war bonds. To accelerate the shift, Congress imposed a 2% tax on state banknotes in 1864, then raised it to a punishing 10% in 1865. Within a few years, the old decentralized currencies were effectively driven out of existence. The pattern becomes even clearer when you look at what came just before. 9 months earlier, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. It promised 160 acres of public land to any adult citizen willing to pay a small $18 filing fee. On paper, a grand democratic opportunity. In reality, turning raw land into a productive farm cost $1,000 to $2,500. Most laborers and small farmers simply could not afford those upfront expenses. As a result, much of the land went to speculators, cattlemen, miners, lumber companies, and railroads. Only about 40% of homestead claims were successfully completed. The act offered free land that most people could not develop without borrowing money, and the new national banking system, created shortly afterward, was perfectly positioned to provide those loans. What rose to replace the old guild networks was often harsher and more controlling: the company town. Lowell, Massachusetts, founded in 1822, served as an early model. By the 1880s, around 2,000 company towns existed. Workers were paid not in regular currency but in scrip, spendable only at the company-owned store. Without outside competition, prices for housing, food, and goods could be set high. Workers frequently fell into debt that bound them to the town. They could not easily leave. 75% of all scrip in America was issued by coal companies in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. The 1894 Pullman strike, involving over 150,000 workers, exposed the deep resentment this system created. A national commission described George Pullman's model as fundamentally un-American. Yet by then, the company-town approach had largely displaced the older guild networks of fair pricing and barter. Sometimes I question if I am imagining connections where none exist. Maybe the timing was just crises. Maybe company towns were an inevitable result of rapid industrialization and concentrated labor. But then I look at groups that still manage to live outside the dominant system. The Amish provide a clear example. They maintain a contribution-based economy rooted in community. When a family faces a medical bill, someone explains the need during church service. The community stays until enough money has been raised. No external insurance, no profit extracted. What disturbs me is that they had to fight hard to preserve this way of life. The Amish clashed with the federal government for years over Social Security, which they saw as compulsory commercial insurance. In 1965, Congress finally granted them an exemption. Today, they file IRS Form 4029 to waive taxes and benefits. The fact that they needed special legal permission proves the older way was made difficult or illegal. The fact that their communities continue to thrive without it proves the old system was workable. There is one more pattern that feels impossible to ignore. Genealogists speak of the 1870 brick wall. The 1870 census was the first to comprehensively name nearly all Americans, including formerly enslaved people. Before that, tracing most family lines becomes far more difficult. The 1890 census, which could have connected so many gaps, was largely destroyed. Damaged first by fire in 1896, then devastated by a major fire in 1921 at the Commerce Department. The surviving fragments sat neglected for over a decade. Then, in 1933, Congress authorized their final destruction. Just one day before President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the new, supposedly fireproof National Archives building. The timing feels almost theatrical. The same decade consolidated national banking, expanded company towns, and made the federal census a powerful tool. Before 1870, most people saw themselves as members of a local community, a guild, or mutual obligations. Afterward, individuals were increasingly defined by wage labor, bank debt, and their place in federal records. What if the guild systems were never truly primitive? What if they represented a genuine alternative path? One that produced furniture lasting 2 centuries and buildings standing proud after 300 years. The Cabinet Makers pricing book was guarded because it demonstrated fairness at the community level, that people could regulate their own economic relationships without needing a bank to intermediate every transaction. I keep coming back to that heavy oak chair in my grandmother's house. It was made without modern bank loans. Its maker was compensated in provisions, goods, or services. He learned his trade through a rigorous 7-year apprenticeship, not formal schooling or debt finance training. He likely never filled out a loan application in his life. When I compare it to mass-produced furniture today, pieces designed to be replaced every 5 years, made by workers paid wages they can barely live on, purchased on credit cards. Credit cards charging interest rates that older usury laws would have condemned. I wonder what we have really gained. We call it progress. But the old chair still stands perfectly level, silent witness to another way of living and working. Why did Guild-era furniture and buildings endure for centuries, while today's debt-financed versions require constant repair? Why was a simple pricing guide considered so sensitive that even Thomas Jefferson was turned away? Why were the 1890 census records ultimately destroyed on the eve of the new National Archives cornerstone ceremony? Why must the Amish file special exemption forms to maintain a community-based system that operated without major incident for generations? And why do so many American family trees suddenly hit a wall in the 1870s? The exact decade when banking power consolidated, the census became more comprehensive, and company towns spread rapidly. I don't pretend to have all the answers. What I have are patterns, interlocking pieces that arrived together. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it.